Hello, everyone, and welcome to NOWIE, or Now Our Watch is Ending. This is the last episode of the NOWIE pregame, though we will have a NOWIE postgame right after Game of Thrones ends tonight. NOWIE was created by LML, or Lucifer Means Lightbringer. He handed it off to me mid-season, right after the Night King died. And now we're finishing it up today. And this is the pregame today, the last pregame episode of NOWIE. So we have two phenomenal guests, one superstar special guest. We'll get to him in just a minute. But first, I want to introduce the person who has basically been a co-host of NOWIE with me. She's been on every episode. Without her, NOWIE wouldn't exist. And she's one of the best analyzers of the books and now the show that there is. Emma Smith, tell them where to find you.
Hello, thank you for that very over-the-top and disproportionate compliment. I'm Emma. You can find me at redmiceatplay.wordpress.com. That's where I post essays and so on. And as the Con of Thrones schedule has been released, then I'm also doing 3 panels at Con of Thrones this year, all on Friday afternoon, all back to back. So that'll be fun. But yeah, so you can find me there chatting all things lady and symbolism.
Fantastic. I'm lucky enough to be on one of those panels with Emma, and I'll be watching the others. So now we come to our superstar special guest. It doesn't always happen in life that what's most popular and what's the highest quality goes together. But once in a while it does. And when that happens, it's really exciting and life-affirming. And so Robert from In Deep Geek, the In Deep Geek YouTube channel, is here with us today. He's one of the leaders of the fandom of these books and television show in every way. And he's shown that people will flock by the thousands and tens of thousands to see commentary on this stuff if the commentary is really thoughtful and really high quality and fantastic. And so, and in addition to that, he's such a genuinely nice guy and so generous with his time. We're so lucky to have him here. So Robert, as if anyone needs to be told where to find you, say hello.
Well, you did say you were going to embarrass me, so thank you for that. Guys, it is an absolute pleasure to be here. I've watched NOWIE before. I appreciate both of your views and your insight. You are fresh and exciting voices within this community, and it's a delight to be here. If you don't know me, my name's Robert. My channel is In Deep Geek. I look at Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire, and also a few other things. I'm going to be branching out to things like Tolkien over the next few months as well. And I did Westworld last year. I suspect I'll do it again next year. But guys, as I say, absolute pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Wonderful. Among a million other things, Robert this week put out what I consider to be the definitive video about why Daenerys burned King's Landing. It's 25 minutes, and it's just perfect. You know, it covers a lot of ground, really, a lot of things that I think needed to be said. He says quickly, but very, very well. A little bit coverage of the whether views of this could be misogynistic, whether they could deal with mental illness in problematic ways. I think at the very beginning he does a great job of doing what a lot of people don't do and think goes without saying, discarding any idea of it being justified. And then also just a lot of this, what most of the video is about. There's more about Targaryen exceptionalism in there than I've seen in a lot of other analyses of this, which I think is really important. And it's just a fantastic video. So I highly recommend it. And we may get into that some today. But I'd like to start out by very simply asking Robert, what do you expect to see tonight?
Oh, wow. That's one of those deceptively simple questions. I could talk for about an hour about that one. I think we are going to see the ending. This is the obvious point, but I think it has to be said. The ending of everybody's character arcs. Now, some of those we'll be happy with, some of those we won't be happy with. But the showrunners, for all their flaws and good points, they do at least try to round off character arcs. So that's the main thing. I think we're going to see this in broadly two halves, is my general feel. I didn't actually do a preview breakdown this week, so you have the exclusive on my thoughts. The first half of it we've seen from the preview is pretty much immediately following on from what happened last episode. We saw that in the trailer. You get Tyrion, Jon, Davos, Arya walking through the smoky ashes of King's Landing. We get Daenerys coming out there about to do her victory speech. So we know what's about to happen. And we can very clearly see a few of the things that are going to happen off of that. Clearly, the first thing Daenerys is going to do is Cersei dead. When they find Cersei, they'll find Jaime. When they find Jaime, she'll realize that Tyrion's betrayed her. Tyrion's going to be in trouble. Davos, we know what he was like when one innocent child was burnt alive. That we know what his views are going to be on this. We know what Jon's views are going to be on this. We know what Arya's views are going to be on this. So the first half of it is going to be that immediate follow-up with actually quite a small cast, because a lot of them have now gone, but it's the people who remain in King's Landing. And the logical place for that is that the people who aren't Dany and Grey Worm will probably try in some way to kill Dany. That's, for me, that is the logical way. Whether they're going to team up or not, I'm not entirely sure, but that is it. I've thought for a long time, it's probably going to be Jon who does it. I did a video ages ago on a completely different subject that came to the same conclusion a couple of years ago, based on the visions that Dany had in the book, in the House of the Undying, that led me to the conclusion that Jon might kill Dany. So I think that is probably where they're going to end that. That's going to be the first half. The second half is the what then. That's when people like Sansa are going to come down, people like Sam are going to arrive, and they have to figure out what happens next. So I think it's going to be a show of two halves. The first half, we know the logic about where this is going to be going. The second half, it's just a matter of trying to round off anybody's stories.
Fantastic. Okay, perfect. Let's talk about all of that. So it sounded like you were saying that if Dany seeks to execute Tyrion, say by fire, you were saying that we know what other characters think about this kind of thing, and you gave Davos as an example. Obviously, he has seen Shireen burn. But one thing I want to raise is Davos himself potentially faces execution, right? Because he was implicated in Tyrion's plot to save Jaime, right? He says, you're the best smuggler in the world. And the point, I think, is that Davos was going to put the dinghy there, or whatever, the boat that Jaime was going to get away on. So I don't know whether Dany will uncover that part of the plan, but I'm not sure they would have put that in at all if she weren't going to uncover it. So it's possible that Davos could also be on trial. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the Tyrion thing they teed up very strongly is that it was they showed that he was there, and we get the Unsullied guards who basically moved aside for him, so they know that he was the last person to see Jaime. If Dany asks, well, where is Jaime, they will say, well, Tyrion went in, and then we didn't know what happened after that, and so that's pretty obvious there. The Davos thing, we saw the boat that was there, Jaime clocked it, but as far as we're aware, nobody else was in on that. So they would have to give us a bit of extra information. He might be in trouble, who knows, but they haven't teed it up in the way that Tyrion is. I think that the main bit there is Tyrion being in trouble with Daenerys. And I think if Daenerys is staying true to form, she should kill him on the spot. That's what she did with Varys the moment she found stuff like that. If they keep him alive, it's only because they like the character, is my personal view. It's not because of anything else. He has failed her so many times now. And if she discovers, she said it's his last chance. If she discovers he's failed her again, then she should kill him on the spot. Don't think she will. I think they'll keep him alive, but I think she should.
Yeah, Right. So I agree with all of that. Let me say that with Davos, you're right. They could go in whatever direction they want. And it comes down to whether, in the same way as you said with Tyrion, whether they want to kill him. So, for example, suppose they don't want to kill Tyrion, but they do want to have Dany move even further, if this is possible, than she's already moved toward alienating Jon and alienating everyone else. She could kill Davos first, right? That would be a plot device if they wanted to. They could have her just find out that Davos was involved and kill him, which would hugely alienate Jon. Davos has become Jon's top advisor. And then she could move toward Tyrion next, and then somehow Tyrion could be saved if they want to save him. That's at least possible. Or, as you say, maybe they'll just leave Davos out of this and just do Tyrion. With respect to Tyrion, it's interesting because Dany basically summarily executed Varys. There was a gathering. There wasn't really a trial. She basically summarily executed Mosador back in Meereen, the guy who killed one of the Sons of the Harpy whom Dany had captured. But the interesting thing is, the reason she executed Mosador is that she was going to have a trial for the Son of the Harpy, and then she didn't get a chance to. So it's possible there could be a trial of Tyrion rather than a summary execution. We've seen 2 trials of Tyrion already, in the Eyrie with Lysa Arryn, and then, of course, in King's Landing, the trial for allegedly killing Joffrey. And in both cases, Tyrion elects trial by combat. So if there were some sort of issue raised of a trial by combat, it would certainly evoke something that Jon said when he first met Dany in the show, which is Dany's father, the Mad King, executed Ned Stark's father and brother when they elected a trial by combat. And the way that Aerys Targaryen did it is he did it with fire. In the show, they change it to he killed both of them with fire. In the books, he killed one of them with fire, not the other. So could it be that Tyrion gets a trial here that evokes the Brandon and Rickard trial that bothered Jon so much, and Jon is watching this kind of thing?
I definitely think so. It would definitely channel the sort of Aerys Targaryen vibe that they're going for with Dany, and I could definitely see something along the lines of, picking a champion, and that champion is Drogon. And that would be such a perfect and terrifying parallel between the Mad King and Dany. That, yeah, I think it's something that the show could feasibly go for.
Robert, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think they could, and I think it would work. What the only thing I've got against is the fact on the show they didn't really cover that. They did take footage of, or they did film for one of Bran's flashbacks, that whole scene with Brandon and Rickard Stark, but then they didn't include it in his flashbacks. And so I think that the showrunners play quite fairly with us, in a sense that they give us the tee up to something and then they give us the payoff for it. And I think if they're going to try and draw that illusion, then they would probably want to give us the thing beforehand to make it actually have some kind of emotional resonance or impact with us. So yeah, I think that's entirely possible. But as a full recreation of what happened with Brandon and Rickard, I don't think they've done the groundwork for that.
Here's the thing, though, Robert. In season 7, when Jon first meets Dany, a very important scene, a highlighted scene, he brings it up. He doesn't have to, but he does. He says, "Your father killed my father's father and my father's brother, burned them both." Now, again, that's a change from the books, but he says it. So if they were going to lead into this, they did lay some groundwork for it. You're absolutely right. Not as much as if they had shown it actually happening in a Bran vision. And they did only mention it once, or maybe before, but they'd certainly mention it then in season 7 in a memorable scene. So I think that's what they would say if they were confronted with the claim that, oh, this is out of the blue.
Yeah, well, far be it from me to disagree with them if that's what they would say. I think that if they were going for a perfect analogy between what happened before and what's happening now, with the greatest of resonances, then it would not be to Davos Seaworth, it would be to a Stark, because that's what that conversation, which you're very right to pick up on, that's what that was about. You know, this Targaryen person killed those Stark people, and this is about, if they're going to recreate a Targaryen person killing a Stark person, I don't think Davos is yet synonymous with the Starks in people's minds for that to be truly analogous.
Totally right. And I would also say that I don't think this is going to be as much of an issue with Davos as it is with Tyrion. You know, Tyrion is the one who's had the trial. So, I mean, maybe they'll kill Davos, maybe they won't. But I was thinking of it with Tyrion. You're right. It could be with a Stark, too, because I do think that Dany has issues with Starks, and that there's an interesting question about how that will play out. I mean, I think I agree with you that it seems very likely that she'll be killed by one of them, perhaps by Jon. I agree with that. I think it's most likely Jon, could be Arya. But she sees Sansa as a rival now. She sees Sansa as an opponent. She basically said it in the last episode. And so who knows who she, I mean, she said also that Jon betrayed her. So, so it's possible that some conflict between Dany and the Starks is one of the precipitating factors of Dany's ultimate demise, if indeed she's going to die. Let's talk also about the what then part, the part that Robert framed as what then. So there's conflict between Dany and Tyrion, perhaps Dany and Davos, certainly Dany and Jon. Ultimately, maybe Jon kills Dany. And we can talk a little bit about the mechanics of that. How do you get past Drogon? I think that's important. What's going to go on with the Unsullied and Dothraki? But I want to skip forward a little bit to afterwards. Suppose Dany is killed. I think we probably all have some thoughts about what might happen then. Let's start with Emma and then go to Robert.
Sansa Queen. That's sort of pretty much where my take is. I think that is primarily an emotional, I just want Sansa to be queen. But there's also, I think there is sufficient seeing up like Sansa's qualifications as leader, her ability to sort of corral quite disparate forces together and get them to cooperate, which is definitely something that you would need after what seems like it's going to be a dragon-led civil war, potentially. Very quick one, but still the sort of implications of a country that has been fighting itself for the past, what in show terms is about 5 years. It definitely will need someone who has the ability to sort of heal those wounds, yeah, and so she has been teed up as a sort of good leader. I mean, even her decision to tell Tyrion about Jon's true heritage is very much kind of like a leader taking the hard decisions that they believe are necessary kind of vibe going on there, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with them. And that she has been quote unquote proved right is, I think, potentially the show teeing up that she is sort of a good ruler TM.
Robert, what do you think? I certainly have thoughts about what Emma said, but I'll save them for after what Robert will happen with the throne.
I mean, I would love Queen Sansa. I don't know whether it's going to happen. I mean, I tend to go through these things in quite a logical way. What happened? If this happens, then what happens after that? If you take my logic that the most likely scenario is that someone, probably Jon, kills Dany, you're right that the first thing is then what about Drogon? So I think they will deal with that. We cannot have a dragon surviving to the end of the episode. Either the dragon dies or the dragon flies off. If it is, it'll have to be in a kind of like Balerion the Black Dread kind of way off to Valyria is my best guess. But Drogon will go. I hope that the Iron Throne will be destroyed, Drogon going crazy. But then you're left with the fact you've got two armies who don't come from Westeros, still in Westeros, whose sole reason for being there is now gone, the Unsullied and the Dothraki. and probably a whole load of people who Varys has previously written off to say, hey, by the way, Jon's the rightful king. That, I think, is going to be what drags people in. So we're going to see Sansa coming down, Sam coming down. I hope we're going to see all of these people who've been sort of forgotten by the plot, people like Yara, people like that random Prince of Dawn that we just vaguely heard about a couple of episodes, people like Edmure Tully, Robin Arryn. These are actually really important and powerful players in what happens next. So I think that the second half for me is most likely everybody gathers and figures out what on earth they're going to do next. That's where it's going to be. Will what happens next be Queen Sansa? Well, it's possible, because frankly, Sansa is probably in the most powerful position in that, if all of that is true, which is that she's obviously got the North on her side. She's also got her uncle Edmure Tully. She's also got Robin Arryn, who will probably do whatever she says. And the other ones, people like Gendry, he's got connections to the North, so she's probably going to be in quite a strong position. The question is whether she actually wants to be Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. I'm now starting to wonder, having thought for a long time it would work really well if her and Tyrion married in a kind of War of the Roses way and ended it all. I do now wonder whether she'll actually just want to be Lady of Winterfell.
If it's not Sansa, Robert, then who do you think it might be?
I kind of hope that, and I don't think they're going to do this, but I kind of hope they don't tell us. I really just think that it's... for me, what matters more is seeing who's there than actually knowing anything else, seeing who the people are. I've said this a few times on my live stream because it really struck me that the showrunners have said that the two series endings that they liked the most were The Sopranos and Breaking Bad. And both of those, no spoilers, but both of those ended in a kind of like whenever the story thematically ended, they ended the show, rather than tying off every kind of loose end. So I kind of hope that they might take that feel and say, okay, so the thematic end is once ice and fire have both been pushed back. That, for me, is the big theme going on here. Ice was dealt with in episode 3. Fire is going to be dealt with now. And now is the age of humanity to try and grow up and figure out what on earth to do. These things haven't gone away forever, surely, but now humanity's time to go and do it. It's the moment that they say, okay, this is how we're going to go about doing it. That, for me, is where the thematic end is, rather than specifically, well, let's make sure this person gets that job, that person gets that job, and all the rest of it. I think the Iron Throne I want to go. I don't want there to be this symbol of power. The One Ring must not survive this. I think the symbol of power has to go. So therefore, should that mean there shouldn't be a king or queen? Personally, I think yes, or at least leaving the option open. If they go with it, I think there's a paucity of options there, is basically what I would say. There are not many standout characters. Jon surely will turn it down.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. So great. So first of all, I think you're absolutely right to identify the major possibility that there won't be an Iron Throne, and not only won't literally be an Iron Throne, but not a ruler of Westeros. Very possible. I mean, that's how it was for the vast majority of Westerosi history. Only in the last 300 or so years did the Targaryens unite the Seven Kingdoms under their rule. So it could be that there's a devolution of power. The North runs itself and the other places run themselves. Entirely possible. It's a major, major possibility. And I think that a lot of people would like that and think that it was a very fair way to end it and a good way to end it. So that is definitely on the table. Very, very much so. If there is a ruler, then I definitely agree with you that I think Jon Snow ruling seems unlikely to me. I think that it's wrong in a lot of ways. It doesn't make sense in a lot of ways. It would be viewed by a lot of people as too conventional, and viewed by people who follow this stuff very carefully as problematic for all sorts of reasons. you know, again, as Emma has said on NOWIE, you have two terrible queens, Cersei and Dany, fighting, and Dany ends up being terrible. Cersei's been terrible all along, and then you have the man come in, and he like saves everyone. So I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think it's going to be Jon. As Robert said, Jon always turns this down. So if it's not Jon, the two people who are being mentioned. Well, let me start with Sansa. I said before the season, I put out videos saying I think Sansa will rule in the end, perhaps with Tyrion by her side. When Sansa first sees the Iron Throne in the first season, Septa Mordain, her Septa from Winterfell, says to her, someday your husband will sit there and you'll be by his side. And then Littlefinger says in season 6 to her that his dream is to sit on the Iron Throne with Sansa by his side. And I think the point is that Sansa will sit on the Iron Throne with Tyrion as her advisor, or who knows, maybe even her husband by her side. So I've said that, and I think that that's out there as a possibility. Sansa has learned how to rule. Of course, it may be that she just rules at Winterfell, not on the Iron Throne. That's entirely possible. If it's not Sansa, if you go to betting markets where people can actually bet money on this, the person who has been the odds-on favorite from before the season, and more so now, believe it or not, is Bran Stark. So I've been thinking a lot about what the heck is up with that? How could that work? And I do have a thought about it, but I want to throw it to you guys first to see what you think about King Bran.
So I don't know how successful that would be as him ruling. He appears not to be hugely interested in the affairs of men beyond, you know, here's some inkling that this dagger is important in defeating the Night King, and also Jon is the legitimate child of Rhaegar and Lyanna. So personally, I'm not a huge fan of it. But I can see if you're strictly following, like, who's around who has some kind of political power or political legitimacy, then he would crop up. But I just don't see where you would get the security in the longevity of the line of like stable leadership, unless he's like unusually long-lived or something. I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree. I can't. Just thinking practically, what would you want Bran as your king? I think no, because he's not the kind of person to give out instructions. He's not clearly got a very strong moral compass, his own himself, but he seems very eager and able to be writing other people off and just in terms of his own agenda. I think what I would say in terms of whether he will end up there, I would have said no until a couple of episodes ago when you got Tyrion talking to him and he says something like, you don't want to be the Lord of Winterfell, and Bran goes, I don't want anything much these days. And it was at the moment that he denies wanting anything was the moment that I go, are you now trying to set this up as being a therefore you will get this? So I've got that nagging thought in my head that maybe they would go there. I don't think he would be a good king. I don't think he'd be the right person to be king. He is clearly, however, as we're talking about Bran, he clearly is trying to manipulate events still. He seems to be trying to take a step back for a while. He seemed to be, well, for an episode maybe, he seemed to be, oh yeah, Jon, you say if you want to say, it's not up to me. If you want to tell them the truth, then that's fine. But he did deliberately push Sam into telling Jon his true identity when Sam was angry about Daenerys. He was very much trying to push things along there. His story was not just about what was going on in the north and the army of the dead. I think that he is the embodiment of this trying to get rid of the weirwood network, and the weirwood network will see both threats, both ice and fire. Fire was the original huge threat to the weirwood network. That was what the first men were doing. They were burning down the weirwood trees. The weirwood network do not like fire. Therefore, he will also be wanting to be getting rid of Daenerys and dragons, pushing them out of Westeros as well. I don't think that necessarily means that he would make a good king or the right king. I can't see that people would particularly want him to be king. I think there are many other people who would make better kings. That doesn't mean the show won't go down that route.
Yeah, exactly. So first of all, I'm really glad you mentioned what happened to the episode before last, where Varys says to Tyrion, maybe the best king is someone who doesn't want it. And he's referring to Jon Snow. But in the same episode, Bran has said to Tyrion that he doesn't want anything. And so, yes, that is potentially setting up King Bran if it happens. Having said that, I completely agree with Robert. I feel that, and Emma, totally, everything that Emma said too. I do not think the show has set up King Bran well enough if that's going to happen. It's not enough to have that one line in season 8, episode 4. There was a little bit with Bran learning from Maester Luwin how to run Winterfell a long time ago when Robb Stark first went south and Bran was the Stark in Winterfell. But that, too, was a long, long time ago, and it's before Bran's transformation. And there's a ton of anti-setup for Bran being king, right? Over and over, Bran says, I'm not that anymore. You know, I can't be Lord of Winterfell. I can't be Lord of anything, he says, because he's something else. He's just something completely different who doesn't really concern himself with the sorts of things, the day-to-day things that kings concern themselves with. It's interesting what Robert said, though, that maybe he's still involved in the game of what's going to happen. So that's interesting. But I think it would be perceived as out of left field if Bran were king, and rightly perceived that way. And I would also say that Robert said something earlier that I completely agree with, and that Emma and I have said a lot, which is that we thought the way this story was going was an anti-magic arc, that we see the danger of too much power, having magical power via dragons or ice or whatever it is. Melisandre does a lot of negative things before she does positive things, and it's basically, it seemed like the people are going to have to rebuild the world slowly and piece by piece, not with the benefit of all this magical power. And Bran being king would be kind of incongruous with that idea. I see Emma nodding. I know she thinks that. Robert, do you agree with that?
Partially, but I think the arc is more anti-ice and fire than anti-magic, if that makes sense. And I think that the weirwood network, certainly the way that it's been set up on the show, and I think that's roughly where we're going to be at with the books, is that the weirwood network represents Westeros, the pure heart of living, breathing Westeros, the idea that the roots are under all of the continent and all the rest of it. They have the memory of everything that's happened there. They are Westeros. And so the fire came later, ice came later, but the weirwood network and all of that kind of old godsy magic, that was what this kind of Gaia imagery is where we're going with it, I think. And so where the move has not been so much against that, it's been against ice and it's been against fire. This is the Song of Ice and Fire. And what's left in the middle is humanity, but that doesn't necessarily mean it possibly will in the books mean the end of it. But on the show, I don't think it necessarily means the end of it here. That's not the bit of magic that's been shown to be bad, per se.
That's awesome, Robert. I'm really glad you said that, because it's going to help me to understand it if it does turn out that Bran ends up king. And I definitely agree with you that the theme seems to be that the trees came first, and they represent supernatural power here, or magic comes from nature. And this is really at the core of what LML's work is about as well. It's that nature has this power, and when people have accessed that power, it's as if the power kind of gets bastardized into an ice form or a fire form, and that's the bad thing. The bad thing is people accessing the power and misusing it. But Bran might arguably see Bran as a person accessing the power, which is the thing that's a little bit dicey about this. But maybe he represents something, not being a person anymore at all, but being sort of the tree itself and nature itself, an extension of nature, like the children of the forest were an extension of nature. And if so, I get it. That's how you could have a magical person ruling potentially, without ruining the theme of this kind of thing is bad. You know, as Robert says, magic isn't necessarily bad in its own right. It's more that the ice and fire forms of it are bad. Let me say, to support that idea about Bran potentially ruling, the first line of the first book is, "We should start back." And Lucifer Means Lightbringer did a great video where he shows how the prologue of A Game of Thrones, the first book, you can understand it in a certain way where the events of the prologue run backwards the same way that they run forwards. If you kind of write down each thing that happens, you can turn the list upside down, and, you know, it works the same way. And you know what? Season 8 actually supports that in terms of the chronology. I, this morning, wrote down the chronology, and it works backwards. So if Bran becomes king. So think of it this way. We're told in the world of Ice and Fire that what came first was god emperors. That's in the Far East, this is the Great Empire of the Dawn. The Dawn. So at the very beginning, there are god emperors, people who may be a little bit like Bran, people who have this power of nature. And then what happens next is Azor Ahai kills Nissa Nissa, probably, or the Bloodstone Emperor kills the Amethyst Empress. Someone like Dany gets killed by a man. Dany has amethyst eyes. And then what happens after that is a cataclysm, some fiery catastrophe, which some of us think was moon meteors, as LML has said. And then the Long Night happens. And then after that, you get the beginning of the regular world as we know it, the beginning of House Stark, the beginning of House Lannister, the beginning of the Citadel, the beginning of the Night's Watch. Okay, so the order of operations is: number 1, God Emperors; number 2, Amethyst Empress dies, Dany figure dies; number 3, Cataclysm, fiery cataclysm. A lot of people are killed in some fiery thing that happens. Number 4, the Long Night. Number 5, regular world. Well, run those backwards. And that's the order we've seen in season 8. We started with the regular world, Starks, Lannisters. Then the next thing that happened was the Long Night, right? Literally an episode called The Long Night. Then the next thing that happened was this fiery cataclysm, Dany burning King's Landing. Then the next thing that we think is going to happen is Dany dying, right? Like the Amethyst Empress dying. And the last thing that could happen is Bran as king, which is the God Emperors. So everything would work exactly in reverse. It would be history reversing itself, which would make sense of the first line of the books being, we should start back. So if Bran ends up on the throne, it's possible that that's what's going on. I know that sounds weird, but we're getting pretty close to it happening. Emma, what do you think?
I really like that. Behind the scenes, Bronte will have seen me when the idea was first broached of a backwards reread of the prologue symbolism, that I got super into it and really enjoyed it. And there's a bunch of chapters that sort of have a point in time where there is like this mirror moment or this point of reflection, usually indicated by we should start back, but also sometimes with a choice of some description. So I really do like the idea of having that mirroring. The only thing is that would then disagree with my broken cycles thing. So obviously I have to pan the entire thing because it doesn't agree with me. So for anyone who's not familiar with that, my argument is that George R. R. Martin likes cycles. He likes looking at repeating cycles, but some of these repeating cycles are things like repeating cycles of violence, and so they have to be broken. And so I think the point would then be, we've seen everything in reverse, so now we need to fix the thing that was wrong in the first place. We've started back, now we need to fix what was wrong, which is having gods on earth in the first place. Mankind, shouldn't necessarily have access to the fire of the gods and this power beyond all reckoning, to the extent that they're no longer human. So
yeah, I mean, that's how I see it too. I understand it if they want to do this reverse thing, and I think that would explain a little bit what's going on with Bran. I think if it were to happen in the books, it would probably be set up much, much more. I don't think it's been set up much at all, and I think people will have a point in saying, what the heck is going on if Bran becomes king? It looks weird. It seems, as you say, Emma, contrary to what I had thought were some of the themes. But as Robert points out, maybe Bran represents a sort of magic that would be okay. I'll throw it to Robert to just say what he thinks about this weird start back idea before I bring up the next topic.
Well, I like it. I do. I mean, I think it's excellent thinking. I think I would agree with you that the books would have to do a lot more detail on this. So for the casual reader, I imagine that the Bloodstone Emperor, Amethyst Emperor, all of this stuff is still just like oh yeah, I vaguely remember a mention of that. And I think that if you're going to make that a key theme of the books, then I think George R.R. Martin will have to bring that out a lot more. So he's got a lot of time to do that. So I'm not going to say he's not going to do that. I'm just going to say he's not done that yet. In terms of this, the show, I think what I would say, and I think I heard Emma, you saying it last week or a version of this last week, I'm not 100% convinced that the ordering of what's happened in this season is going to be the same as what happens in the books. So I wouldn't necessarily say that just because we have Dany burning King's Landing in the penultimate episode, that means it's going to be in the penultimate chapter or anything like that. It could happen a lot earlier than that. So I think that there's we shouldn't rush to conclusions on what's going to happen in the books based upon what happens in the series. The broad beats are going to be the same, but some of the detailing, including some of the ordering, will be slightly different, I would personally predict.
Definitely. You know, when the Night King was destroyed before Cersei, I was shocked. And I thought that they were just doing it because they wanted to kind of keep Lena Headey in it longer, or they wanted to decrease Dany's power to make the fight with Cersei more interesting or seem less of a foregone conclusion or something like that. But then Emma said that actually she thought that it could happen in the books this way too. And then it turns out that when I was forced to think about Bran being on the throne, I realized this backwards thing works this way a lot better. So it's possible that the ordering will be the same, even though, as Robert says, I initially thought definitely it's not going to be, but it might be.
Well, can I just clarify that last point? I think that from everything George R.R. Martin said about his ending and what he loves about the Scouring of the Shire, I am personally reasonably convinced that the end of the others will happen before the end. That's not going to be the end of the story. We're going to have that, and then there's going to be this other thing which happens probably down in King's Landing. The bit of ordering that I'm not sure about is whether the Scouring of the Shire bit is Dany burning it, or whether that happens earlier, and then the whatever happens with the others in the books happens, and then we get what happened, the remainder left. Because in the books, obviously, we've got an entirely different plot with Aegon coming in just a few miles away from King's Landing. They could well take King's Landing. Dany will then bring her invasion fleet, and what happens there could be the moment where there's the burning of King's Landing, and then after all of that has happened, and there's whatever happens up in the north, then we get the Scouring of the Shire. So that could be the order that I could see it. I've not given a huge amount of thought yet to try and figure out exactly what the show ordering means for the book ordering. I will do that once we're past season 8 and I've had a chance to have a little sleep. But that's my current best thought on where we're at.
Yes, agree completely. Emma, go ahead.
Yeah, so my personal thought is something very, very similar. I think the Fagon plotline, even though I really don't like saying Fagon, but it's easier. The Fagon plotline will happen before the others. I think Dany, aided and abetted by a really dark, really nihilistic, really vengeful Tyrion, which we see in A Dance with Dragons. He's been completely whitewashed in the show pretty much, and Brynden Beefish has just put out a really good essay about that, so I'd recommend checking that out. But that sort of incentivizes Dany towards a sort of darker fire and blood path that she has already personally been sort of choosing at the end of A Dance with Dragons. Then you've got Tyrion, who's in a dark place, egging her on. The unexploded wildfire that's hanging around from her father's days. And so, as Brynden Beefish and Emmett mentioned, Paul Quentin mentioned in the Not a Cast summary of the Bells, they could easily see how you end up with a Dany who feels rejected by this populace, the populace of King's Landing, or, you know, in love with this pretender who's clearly not real. He doesn't have dragons, but she does, and Tyrion's egging her on when he's there, like, the people of King's Landing were so ungrateful that I saved them all from Stannis and Wildfire. And I could easily see that version of Daenerys turning her flames on the innocents of King's Landing. The horror of the wildfire, just, you can see this sort of jade demon erupting and dancing, and the entirety of King's Landing just being decimated, which is not what she would have intended, causing a rethink, sending her to say up to the others. And then you have Euron just pitching up out of nowhere to be king over the charnel pits and everything that he sort of put forward as his manifesto in the Winds of Winter spoiler chapter. And then his being this ultimate human magical threat that people then have to sort of face down after the others, so that they're sort of the horrific actions of a human seeking magical power for the sake of power is never realised. I can see something along those lines happening. I'm obviously not dead set of that, and I wouldn't be disappointed if George decided that that's not what he wanted to do, but that's how I could see it playing out.
I love it, and I wouldn't be surprised if he decides that that is what he wants to do. Robert, do you have any thoughts about this season 8 with respect to the Azor Ahai story?
Many thoughts. So the short version is that I think that they have very clearly just said, nah, we're not dealing with that. This comes with a general view, I think, that they're just saying, okay, so prophecy is not what we're about in the show. Now, they downplayed it a lot anyway. You know, the visions in the House of the Undying were cut down hugely. We got a cut down version of Maggie the Frog's prophecy. They've not majored on Azor Ahai previously. They've mentioned it a few times, but they've not gone into detail. And to one extent, I'm sympathetic to this, to the extent that George R.R. Martin has been very clear that actually what he cares about is not the truth of the gods' prophecies and all the rest of it. What he cares about is how people react to it. That's what drives the action. It's not what matters is not whether Melisandre is right in all of her beliefs. What matters is the fact that Melisandre believes passionately she's right, and as a result, hugely important things happen. So that kind of fits with this. If I'm being charitable, the showrunners have taken that approach and said, okay, so any prophecy actually doesn't matter. They only matter in as much as people believe in them. My slightly snarky view is that they have just thought, you know, as with so many other things, this isn't necessary for the plot, so we'll get rid of it. I do have a bit of a thought that, as we were talking about earlier, that the Jon killing Daenerys thing has got clear Azor Ahai, Nissa vibes to it. However it happens, as I say, the video I did a couple of years ago, which I'm kind of hope I gave it the title a couple of years ago, "Will Jon Kill Daenerys?" And I'm now wondering whether it's going to get a whole load of random views if Jon does kill Daenerys, and it's completely book and nothing to do with the show. But that came from those visions in the House of the Undying, and this idea that she has to light one more fire, and so that is where that comes from. And Daenerys lights lots of fires, but almost always with her dragons. And actually, personally, the only ones she's lit were the Khal Drogo's funeral pyre and the one we saw on the show with the Khals, where she's like burning down where all the what's it called, the place where all the Khals were. So those are the only two. So the third one, given the Nissa Azor Ahai illusions, it made me wonder, as she also has to suffer one more treason, whether or not this might be Jon plunging a sword into her heart and bring it back out, and it being flaming as a kind of a symbolism. That worked for me in the books. I wonder whether, therefore, they might do not that exact thing. I doubt that if he did stab her, it would come out being a fiery sword. I think that would be a bit too symbolic for the show, but I think that that would be a thing that they might well go down that route as a nod to it, if that makes sense. Completely not connected to what Azor Ahai was about. But actually, just one other, this is just a random thought. The thing that's always bothered me about Azor Ahai, and why I think it actually might happen in the books, is that we don't actually get the whole point, what we would think naturally is the point of the Azor Ahai myth, which is he forges this sword, what for? To go off and save the universe and all the rest of it. We never actually see him do anything with the sword. He doesn't go out. We have no idea what he actually did once he gets this. It's the whole story is about him forging it, which is like dull, apart from the fact that he ends up killing the love of his life, as far as we can tell. So clearly the point is not him going forth and saving humanity. The point of the story is the fact that he killed Nisa Nisa.
Right. And maybe that is the point, that has long been the LML interpretation, that the reason that that's the part we get is that killing Nisa Nisa was what mattered, not forging the sword to then go do something with it. The idea could be that he starts the long night, doesn't end it. I definitely agree with the interpretation that others have made, that the point, I think of the context in which we hear the story. I believe it's Salador San tells it to Davos. And Davos concludes, gee, I'm not a hero like Azor Ahai. I can't imagine stabbing my wife in the heart and killing her. And the point, I think, is supposed to be that Davos is good, that heroes are bad, maybe. And here we really see that in the last episode, right? Dany is a hero, and there's this line that Robert quotes in his video: "Madness and greatness are two sides of the same coin." Right? So these great people like Azor Ahai, what do? Azor Ahai stabs his wife in the heart and kills her. Dany is this great person. Now, she really has done great things, freeing the slaves and everything, but what does she ultimately do in the show? She kills everybody. So there's something that's the thumbs up is being given, I think, by the author to people like Davos who are not heroes. Arya, in one of the last episodes, says to Sandor that she doesn't like heroes. And that's a positive message about Arya. So maybe the point is that Azor Ahai was the bad guy or something, but that doesn't fit probably with Jon killing Dany. If Jon executes Dany and that's supposed to be the Azor Ahai killing Nissa Nissa thing, then the interpretation I've just given is not the one that's being evoked. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Arya.
Can I just say something?
Absolutely.
So I would say there is a dialogue going on here about the ultra Machiavellian nature of like heroic acts and the sort of need to do something which is truly terrible, but for the quote unquote greater good. Like what is utilitarian more than Machiavellian, I guess. And we are probably going to see that with Stannis' arc when he inevitably burns Shireen. We are seeing it with Dany's arc. She is the prophesied savior. That is something that will come up in her book arc a lot more as she goes to Volantis. She meets all of these priests who are there sort of prophesying she is the savior reborn. The dragons prove it. She is this, she is the savior. Therefore, what wrong can she do, because she's here to save mankind, kind of thing. So if there is that sort of dialogue going on, then it's may not necessarily be a casting of good and bad, but an exploration of that topic. Ultimately, I think George will fall down on the side of don't kill people as a summary sort of take home point.
It's a perfect lead-in to what I was going to talk about next, which was, Emma has been talking about this on NOWIE as a major theme of the story, an anti-violence message, which I agree with. I think it's right. I mean, George has said openly that he's, his history of anti-war is well known. And so, but the question I have is about how this interacts with Arya's arc, which I'm gonna throw to Robert in a second, and then to Emma. So Arya and Sandor part ways in the last episode, literally, right? He takes one path, she takes the other. He takes the path of violence. He chooses violence. He's always been about vengeance. Now, we could draw a distinction between vengeance and violence if we want to, and maybe that's the answer to this. But Arya doesn't continue down this path she's been on where it's all about vengeance, it's all about killing people. She goes away and she tries to help people instead of killing people. Now, if we're thinking about how Dany could be defeated in tonight's episode, there are lots of different possibilities, but one possibility is that Arya plays a major role in that. Maybe Arya fires an arrow into the eye of Drogon and kills Drogon. She's been shooting 1 million arrows from the very beginning of season 1 all the way through now season 8. Why is she shooting all those arrows? Maybe it's to foreshadow she shoots Drogon in the eye or something. Or maybe she kills someone else, who knows. But would that contradict the arc that we just were told about with Arya, where we thought she just took a turn away from violence? What's going on with that?
Yeah, I don't know is the short answer. I think that what we had very clearly, and I don't think I'm telling you anything you don't already know, but we had Arya for 7 seasons was on this path of vengeance and becoming a kick-ass assassin and all the rest of it. That's what she was all about. This season, the showrunners have deliberately, in 101 different ways, tried to show her as softening, becoming more human, and that's yes, it was what happened last episode, but also with the Gendry thing. There was the hugging her relatives. There was also a little bit the previous season as well with Ed Sheeran and Hot Pie and things like that. So they've been trying to build towards this idea that actually this isn't an inevitable arc for her to end in death and retribution and all the rest of it. So it made sense to me that they got to that point. It was a little bit rushed and all the rest of it, but I understood it, that the Hound actually cares about her and actually didn't want her to end up like him, because he recognized that he'd lived his life in a certain way, that he didn't want her to be living her life and to be the kind of person that he didn't want her to be. So I kind of understood that, and then her going off and helping innocent people, or trying to help innocent people, failed miserably, but the thought was there, and then saying hi to horses, all of this kind of thing I got it. But so I don't know what that means that they'll do with her, whether she's having given up this idea that she has to get vengeance. What is left? I think that it's protecting, from the only thing we've seen basically is protecting the innocent. That's the only thing that we've got about the new Arya after she went away, was that she was there, she saw what was happening and she was protecting the innocent from something. And so it makes sense in that to follow that on, say, what's the way that I, with my unique skill set, can protect the innocent? Well, that is to try and stop the bad person who's been doing all of this. I kind of understand that. It's a little bit weird and a little bit forced, and I think that it's kind of, a lot of these story arcs come from, I suspect, George R. R. Martin saying, well, this is where they're going to end. Jaime and Cersei are going to end and die in each other's arms. And so they go, well, how are we going to get from there to here? Well, we'll just hurry this one along by doing that. And so I think that that's probably where they're going to end, and he's going to say something like, and she's going to let go of her kill list and all the rest of it, but also she needs to be doing this. And they're trying, well, how do we do that? And I think they just sort of garbled the timing of some of these things. So, yeah, I think she's more likely to be taking the retribution on Drogon than on Dany. I think Dany is Jon's to deal with. And so that perhaps is slightly, I mean, whether you count trying to kill a dragon as being different from trying to kill a human, I don't know. I guess that's a matter of perspective, but that's different from having a kill list of humans you're wanting to do. This is killing the creature. Dragon is a creature of some kind, the creature that did so much damage. So I think perhaps that's the way they're going to try and get it to work.
Yeah, I completely agree there. And the way that I've been thinking about it is that Dany has turned away from this path of vengeance, but she is still uniquely skilled as a sort of specialist, force, like violent force. So I think what we could see is some kind of commentary about the need for a specialist force to dismantle the tools of tyranny. And that is what Drogon is for Daenerys right now. He is a tool of tyranny, and where she gets her power and her fear from at the moment.
Very interesting. So Emma, you think killing Drogon doesn't count as violence?
Yeah, I think if you're going to sort of use a similar, like, George is a pacifist, but has said that he would fight the Nazis. So I think there is a line to be drawn that George is drawing somewhere. What constitutes tyranny and a sort of violation of rights of individual liberty, and also and where we sort of save that for the system, and the violence against the system rather than necessarily the individuals trapped within it. How that plays out without mass violence to thousands of people is an entirely different matter. But
so Robert is going to go soon, but I'll ask him about one last thing before he does go, because something that's been on my mind a lot in thinking about this story, and I'm really curious what he thinks about it. Robert, I think that one of the ways someone could read the last episode and what Dany does is that it says something about her nature. It was driven by her Targaryen nature, and they really kind of suggest that by having in the previous episodes, the scenes from previous episodes, they have this this line where every time a Targaryen is born, it's like a coin flip, right? So there's this they're emphasizing her nature as one thing that drove what happened, and that's a potentially troubling theme if misunderstood. I think there's probably a way to understand it that makes it not a dangerous message or a problematic message. But I was wondering if you had thoughts about that, because it would seem to be not what I thought this is all about. If the point is, hey, you're just doomed by your birth, you are who you are, you're genetically one thing, and that's it, and so you're just eventually going to kill everybody because that's who you are and there's no escaping it. I don't think that's the message of the story. So is there a better way to understand this aspect of it?
Yeah, well, I don't think Game of Thrones as a whole, The Song of Ice and Fire as a whole, plays into that narrative that you are who you were born to be. I think there are plenty of characters. We saw Theon at the end of this, who was who he was born to be, and then went through this huge redemptive arc and ended up in a good place. And I don't think so the idea that the show is trying to tell us that you are just who you were born to be is I don't think that holds much water. My general take, you said some very kind things about my video earlier, and thank you. So I've got my more considered thoughts are there, but my general take on this is that there are many, many reductionist views on what Daenerys did. And I think that it doesn't actually behove any of us to be upholding this was just whatever. And if anyone says what happened there was just her going mad, or just her being scorned by Jon, or just her genetics, or just her anything, this was not the way it has been set up at all. There are so many different factors playing into that. We saw there are some long-term factors. Yes, her upbringing is part of what makes her who she is, and therefore played into the things that she does. It's the same for me, it's the same for you, it's the same for everyone. But also she went through a huge amount of really quite traumatic things. She lost her children, her best friend, her protector. She had a relationship breakdown. So many different things going on in the space of just a few weeks that also clearly played into what was going in. There was so much going on in that moment. Now, we may argue about whether or not the showrunners handled it well, but I think that they did show us that there was a lot going on in there. And any interpretation of what happened that starts with this was just I think is wrong. This was a huge number of different factors playing in there, and we shouldn't be reductionist about it.
Fantastic. And on that note, on that terrific note, Robert, would you like to say farewell to everybody?
I would love to. First of all, thank you so much for having me on. It's been an absolute pleasure and a delight. You guys are erudite and wonderful, so it was great being on here. And the chat, I've been watching it go through. There's been so many fantastic people in the chat. Hi everyone, great to be here, and happy to come back on at any time in the future. Like, if you don't know, by the way, my channel is In Deep Geek, and the reason I'm going is not because I'm bored or anything like that, but I've got my own live stream which is starting in less than an hour. I just need to go away and have a little bite to eat before we start that, so that's why I'm nipping off now. But thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming on.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Well, that was awesome. Hi, Emma. It's just us now, just like old times. So, okay, very interesting. Robert said a lot of interesting things, and one of them, the thing about Bran potentially representing undisturbed weirwood magic, was very interesting. It could help understand if it does end up being Bran. I'm kind of still rooting for it not to, but we'll see. You know, we can try to figure out whatever it is that they do. So there are a bunch of things we could talk about. I think before getting back to this theme of identity, because I do have other thoughts about that. Let's talk mechanics a little bit, or logistics. If we're right that Jon kills Dany, how does it happen? Right now, Dany appears to have the allegiance, at least at the moment, if we look at the scenes from the next episode from last time, seems to have the allegiance of Grey Worm and the Unsullied, as well as the Dothraki, however many are left, and of course, Drogon. So that doesn't mean she's impossible to kill. Varys tried to poison her. But if we have this image of Jon executing her or something, how does that end up happening? What happens to the Unsullied, the Dothraki, and Drogon?
I have absolutely no idea, is the simple answer to that. I think one of the possible courses of action is obviously Jon is still nominally loyal to Daenerys. He and his forces are still right outside King's Landing. And presumably there will have to be some kind of in-person confrontation. And presumably Dany and Jon, given their prior history, will not want to have that play out in front of the entire court and both their armies. Like that. So there is scope within the narrative that makes sense for Jon and Dany to have some private time together to work through their issues. But I don't entirely know. Like, I'm still trying to sort of emotionally process Tyrant Dany, to be honest. So the sort of next stages of how the mechanism works with presumably Jon killing Dany, although I don't like the idea, is not something that I have the foggiest about. Absolutely no idea.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that, because it's not that easy to think about and figure out. Let me throw out some ideas. So already there's the possibility of Arya killing Drogon with an arrow to the eye, or perhaps Bronn killing Drogon, since Bronn might have an interest in that, and Bronn has this history with dragons. He knocked Drogon out of the sky at the loot train attack in season 7. So that's one category of possibilities. And perhaps if Dany were to lose Drogon, the Dothraki, who follow strength, might abandon her. We don't know. It's at least possible. I also don't think that the Unsullied are necessarily 100% of a lock to remain loyal to Dany. After all, Grey Worm said to Missandei earlier in this season, once Dany takes the throne, I'm out of here. let's leave and go to Noth. So it might be that now that she's taken the throne, that their commitment to protecting her is not absolute and could be shaken by one thing or another. Yet another possibility is that something wild happens, like Bran wargs the dragon, and it turns out that he has all the power, and so the Dothraki who follow power now follow Bran, and that's how the Bran king thing evolves. What do you think about that?
Well, I am enjoying the tinfoil millinery that you currently have going on. It's a take. I have never been a huge fan of people walking dragons, just because I feel like that is something which is I don't think humans should necessarily be able to do. We see pain as fire, and fire itself, drive a spirit out of animals. So an animal that is literally fire made flesh, as has been made clear a number of times, does not necessarily, to me, it doesn't seem like they should be walkable. So I'm not sure that Bran, being Drogon, being king, is how it's going to play out.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think you're right to call it tinfoil. It's tinfoil. I'm throwing it out there in case. I mean, the idea of Bran working a dragon is a fairly conventional idea from over the years, right? When the three-eyed raven in the show says to Bran, "You won't walk, but you will fly." The one interpretation of that has always been, well, what flies? Dragons, right? We know Bran wargs animals. He wargs direwolf, so maybe he can warg a dragon and fly that way. Now, since then, we've seen him fly by warging ravens. But I don't think it's too out of left field to talk about the idea of Bran warging a dragon.
Yeah, I don't think it is ridiculously out of left field, but it's not my preferred interpretation, if that makes sense. Like, we see, for instance, in the prologue of Dance with Dragons, we see Varamir fly, and that is literally just his soul in the air being transported between his body as it's dead into the weirwood tree and then into one of his wolves. So I feel like that sort of literal version of astral projection, like literally just your soul flying the world, feels a lot more natural to me, given that we've seen that mechanism, and we've also seen that fire can drive out a spirit rather than retaining it. And we also see like people like Quaithe manifesting in starlight and things like that. So it's a thing, to sort of just have your spirit in the ether, I think.
Definitely. And look, Bran, I agree with you with everything you said. Along those lines, right? We have this connection between Bran and the wind. Bran hears the wind, and Osha tells him, she says that you're hearing the gods, and he says it's the wind, and she says, who do you think sends the wind, right? So there's this connection between the wind and the gods, people with the old gods, right? And Bran is obviously connected with the concept of the old gods because it's all about the weirwood trees. He attaches to the weirwood tree. Not just that, but he calls out to Ned Stark in the show, in the flashback, young Ned Stark, and Bran says he heard me, and the three-eyed raven says, well, maybe he heard you, maybe he heard the wind. And so the idea of Bran as the wind is an idea. I mean, look, if you believe, as I do, in the LML theory that the long night is all this ash that's sent up into the sky that blocks the sun, how does the long night end? Well, the simplest physical explanation is that the wind blows the ash away. So the idea that some ancient person was able to become nature, right? Become part of nature and blow that away is entirely in keeping with the understanding of the ancient events that many of us believe. So, okay, so I agree. So that's just a really long way of saying, yes, I think that he probably won't work into a dragon. But hey, you never know. A lot of things have happened that I didn't expect, so that could happen too. Okay, let's. So let's just say if that's not what happens, how do you see? You think maybe Arya kills Drogon? Is that possible?
Yes. So since I heard you do your Arya archery video about Viserion, but now it could equally apply to Drogon. Like symbolism is pretty much the same. And then I think it's been floated around by other people in the fandom as well. So I definitely think it is a strong possibility that Arya will take out Drogon. And again, that might be a sort of parallel to sort of forces needing to take out the tools of tyranny kind of thing.
Yes. Okay.
Like that is the acceptable use of force, is to dismantle tyranny.
Yeah, we might have to underline the tools of tyranny, because here's the thing, Emma, and this is good. This is good for you and me to discuss, because we've been talking about this kind of thing, and I've basically accepted your views about it. I think they're right about this being the anti-violence message. Dany characterizes herself as doing just that, right? She is eliminating tyranny in her eyes, right? Cersei is tyranny, and she's eliminating tyranny. So it's okay what she's doing. It's not her fault. She's not really killing the people. Cersei is, even if indirectly. I mean, she says Sansa is responsible for Varys's death, right? Because Sansa told the secret, right? When here, obviously, Dany directly kills Varys, but she's blaming Sansa for it. Here, Dany kills all these people in King's Landing, but she's blaming Cersei for it. But her story is, I'm the one eliminating tyranny. So I think it would be in tension with the theme of the story if Arya returns to violence, and the point is, hey, it's okay because she's just taking out the tyrant. Well, what we've been told is the people who say they're taking out the tyrant are using it to justify violence, and violence is not justified.
Yeah, and I think there's that sort of commentary about when you are, taking out a monster, you need to be careful, or like when you're staring into the abyss, you need to be careful that you're not becoming the monster that you're trying to fight. And I think Dany is an example of that failing catastrophically. Whereas I feel like if focus is on dismantling the tools of tyranny, and instead you save the tyrant for a fair trial with, the outcome being justice, not vengeance, then that might be the sort of preferred outcome in what we would consider in a sort of modern democratic sense, which I feel like is sort of being shifted and angling towards.
I was looking at Jojo Lady Dane's interesting point about how maybe Dany tells the dragon to burn Jon, but he pulls a Night King 2.0 and doesn't burn, or Drogon refuses to do it. Those are interesting ideas. I like it. It's very possible, and I like the idea. But just as I was distracted and looking at that, remind me, Emma, what's the answer to this idea of if force is used against Dany, why doesn't that violate this story of you're not supposed to use force?
Because if you're using violence against a tyrant, that can cross the line into vengeance, and it is very personal, and it is also violence against another person without due process, basically. There's been no fair trial, there's been no hearing. Even we have that for all kinds of war crimes. So I think to take the decision of being judge, jury, and executioner, no matter how bad someone's actions is, that is morally wrong, and you can't do that. It's morally wrong. Don't do it. But something needs to be done to prevent the tyrant doing worse harm in the meantime, and so you have to sort of dismantle their tools of power and what helps them keep absolute control over the populace. And what Dany's mechanism for control is at the moment is primarily Drogon. So by killing Drogon, it is kind of liberating the population from the excesses of tyrannical power, whilst also needing to detain the tyrant to make sure that you know, they are not just summarily executed, which is, you know, a hallmark of tyranny, but instead they face a trial and, you know, have a chance to put forward their case. I feel like I'm talking to the right person.
I actually had that thought myself. I think this is great. Yeah, great point. So if we see that tonight, if we see Jon execute Dany only after a trial, a real trial, not a sham trial like we've seen so many times in the story, Tyrion's sham trial orchestrated by Tywin in King's Landing, Tyrion's sham trial orchestrated by Lysa Arryn in the Eyrie. So if we see a real trial, that would be in keeping with everything you're saying. I love it. I absolutely love it. And I understand taking down Drogon as an example of eliminating the means of oppression. What about the Unsullied and Dothraki? What happens with them?
Very good question. I mean, they are also those tools, but then this is where I think this is where most of the sort of what constitutes like a level of violence that is acceptable in our society comes into play, because these are armed men, primarily men. These are armed men who are kind of cogs in Daenerys's tyrannical system at the moment. But they are also people. So this is where that sort of, like, Drogon is a very clear-cut case of, you know, that's fine, is an animal. Even though it's sad and magic will be gone, it is also, like, effectively, like, a nuclear weapon in the hands of someone unstable. So, forget the use of unstable there, someone who's tyrannical or obsessed with power. So, yeah, I think that's where the sort of line, that is where we explore our personal feelings about what extent of violence is acceptable to us. And I think that's something for the sort of individual to draw a conclusion about.
It's also possible that they could, if Arya were to kill Drogon, one way to look at it would be what you're saying now, which is that, oh, Drogon's an animal and he's sort of a nuclear weapon, so that's different, right? That's a kind of violence that doesn't count as bad. But there's another way to look at it, which is that it does count as bad, which is that in the same way that you have Jaime Lannister undergo this long arc where his character changes, he learns, he gets very far toward the good, and then at the end he falls back. He can't complete the journey and just stay with Brienne and be like Brienne now. He can't do that. In the end, he fails to complete his redemption arc. And you see Grey Worm, to me, very tragically, undergo this long humanization arc where these terrible, unimaginable things were done to him as a child, and he was dehumanized. He became a weapon. And then he's humanized over the course of the story. Missandei playing a leading role in that humanization process, and Grey Worm changes, and he becomes not a weapon, but a person. And then he falls back when Missandei is killed, and we see Grey Worm just zealously murdering soldiers who've thrown down their weapons. And it's so sad. You could argue that that's the Arya story, right? If Arya kills, I'm not saying this is what's going to happen necessarily, but suppose Arya kills Drogon, we do get a lot of humanization of animals, a lot of negative judgment of people who dehumanize animals, like Ramsay dehumanizes animals, mistreats animals, doesn't view his hounds as, the way he should. He calls them beasts, and you get this discussion, right? Jon calls Dany's dragons beasts, and Dany says, I don't see them as beasts. So it could be that even in killing Drogon, the point is that Arya couldn't get away from violence. She, like Jaime and like Grey Worm, she tried, she almost succeeded in changing, and then she didn't. That's one way to look at it if she kills Drogon. Or if she kills other people. Possible?
Yeah, that is possible. And it was a thought that was occurring to me as I was sort of describing Drogon as just an animal, like, because in show canon, of course, dragons are described as super intelligent and far more intelligent than they are in the books. In the books, they're essentially big fiery dogs. Yeah, it's a difficult one, and again, I feel like it's one of those things like that because we're dealing with tyranny. Sorry, my face disappeared off the screen there. Because we're sort of dealing with this sort of evaluation of how far do you go to stop evil. That is, I guess, kind of one of the major explorations of the entire arc. Like, how far do you go to stop the others, which are literally like death incarnate with no mercy? How far do you go to stop tyrants? How far do you go in your violence to do that? So I think it ultimately is not necessarily designed to give us a definitive answer. It's designed to make us probe our own beliefs and probe what we think is, the quote unquote right thing to do at any one point in time. And that's going to be subjective, inherently subjective. And I don't necessarily think that there is a right answer.
Interesting. That's very interesting. I think you're right about that. But I also think that George has some things he wants to say. And I like the point that you've made a lot, that one of the things he wants to say is that violence is a problem. Even when you think it's being used for good, too often people think that they're using it for good or say that they're using it for good, and they're not. Okay, let's talk a little bit about identity, something I raised at the end right before Robert left. I have a thought about this that I'd like to try out on you, Emma. So Robert is certainly right that they're not saying that Daenerys was condemned to always do this, that there was no doubt she would always do it. Indeed, Benioff and Weiss went on camera and said exactly the opposite of that. They said if circumstances had gone differently, Dany never would have done this. Understood. However, it's also very clear that one of the things that's being said is that Dany's Targaryen identity was a part of what caused this to happen. That's why they say when Targaryens are born, the gods flip a coin or something like that. And so, I mean, Varys says that, I think, in the last episode. So you don't say that unless you're making the point that part of what's going on here is that Dany is inclined more to do this than she would be if she weren't a Targaryen, meaning that the Targaryen bloodlines or something have something to do with this. And that's potentially a disturbing message. But I had a thought about how it could be the kind of thing that George might say, George R. R. Martin, even though I don't think George R. R. Martin at all believes in the kind of genetic determinism that is kind of the most disturbing way to read this. And here's my thought. Here's my thought that I want to try out on you and see what people think. The Targaryens are very specific in that they want to keep their bloodlines pure, right? All of this incest, people marrying their sister, their brother, over and over again for thousands of years. Well, for the Targaryens, hundreds of years, but the Valyrians before them for thousands of years. That is clearly being indicted by George R. R. Martin, I think. And I think that it's not just the Targaryens, right? Cersei, who's on the other side of this fight, is the product of Tywin Lannister marrying a woman who, before she married him, was named Joanna Lannister, right? Tywin Lannister marries his first cousin, Joanna Lannister, and produces Cersei. And so, and Tywin is the kind of guy who wants to replicate himself perfectly, right? He wants his children to be exactly like him. and so do the Targaryens. And that, I think, is what's being disfavored. The idea is that when you try to replicate yourself exactly with your children, that's messed up. That is a violation of nature. And that's kind of what the Night King does, right? The Night King takes babies and turns them into replicas of himself. So if you're the kind of parent who wants to make your child an exact replica of yourself, then you're like the Night King, you're like Tywin Lannister, you're like the Valyrians or the Targaryens, you're a villain of this story. The right way to do it is to have babies who are part you and part something else, right? So you've got Jon Snow, who's half Stark, half Targaryen. You've got Tyrion, who in the books probably is half Lannister, half Targaryen. Sansa is half Stark, half Tully, and clearly has elements of both. And I think that this kind of blending is being given the thumbs up by George, the author of the story, and the resisting the blending is being given the thumbs down.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. So I definitely agree with the idea that imposing your personal moral standards on your children and forcing them to do exactly what you believe that they should be in accordance with your worldview is definitely being frowned upon, to say the least. And like, we see exactly how much damage Tywin does to all of his children, not just Cersei, but Tyrion and, well, not necessarily biological children, but to all of the children that he's raising. Cersei, Jaime, and Tyrion are all really psychologically scarred from their being raised by Tywin. Just because he has forced them to be in a particular way, and whether they're railing against that or happy to conform with it, then it's damaging either way. And you contrast that with someone like Ned, who lets his children be a lot more like themselves. Like, he's willing to give Arya, pay for Arya to have dancing, quote unquote, dancing lessons, and things like that. Then I think that, yeah, the idea of not forcing your children to be exactly like you is definitely a prominent one. I think it does, as someone said in the chat, I'm really sorry I didn't catch your name, but someone said how it's very much like the dancing on our parents' puppet strings line from Tyrion. How this sort of enforced either like social norms or ideas of exactly what needs to happen, like with the Southron Ambitions plot, for instance, that Stefan Sarce, I think, is the guy who's come up with it, about how Rickard Stark was forcing all of his children into these marriages with other kingdoms in order to fulfill his personal ambitions, and how that sort of kicked off Robert's rebellion and was a bad thing. So I think that is all very much in line with the sort of commentary that you're saying there. Regarding it being genetic, I don't know. I think just forced inbreeding in general is a lot more. It just inherently does cause more problems, both physical and mental, as well as just being a really weird family dynamic, which also is going to put stress and strains on there. But we do see that commentary from Oberyn about how all you Westerosi think that you're animals, and things like that. So there's a lot of identification with various different sigils and stuff that's also playing into this sort of dynamic of who you are. I don't know if that's answered any sort of question whatsoever, but I was just sort of throwing, just sort of off the cuff.
Oh, definitely, always. So, okay, but let me mention quickly another theme that I think they're playing up, which I liked, which is self-sacrifice. So that's something we went into this season thinking was a major theme. I talked about it. Melanie Lot 7, who has been on NOWIE, has talked about it a lot. And they emphasize it, right? Varys, I thought it was a little bit weird that it was so contradictory to what Varys' character has been until now. Varys was always the guy who openly said that he's not sacrificing himself, right? He basically says it to Ned Stark in the first season, I'm not a hero. Ned Stark says, why don't you free me? And Varys isn't going to do that because it's a risk to himself. And that's how he explains to Dany what he did. He always wanted to keep himself alive, even when he disagreed with what the rulers did whom he served. And then suddenly he says, I will protect the realm no matter the cost to myself. He says that in season 8 to Tyrion, and then that's what he does. He basically knows, we're told by Benioff and Weiss that he knows he's going to die probably, but he does it anyway to save everyone. That's a new look for Varys, kind of sudden new look, but whatever, okay, fine. The point is self-sacrifice is good. Varys does it. Varys clearly was in the right. He foresaw that Dany might do this thing that she did, and she did it. And he dies trying to stop it. Now, whether he tries to stop it in the best ways, who knows? But, he tries to poison her. But still, he does try to stop it. Tyrion also talks about self-sacrifice in the last episode when he goes to Jaime, and Jaime says, she's going to kill you, right? Dany is going to execute you for freeing me. And Tyrion says something like, tens of thousands of innocent lives, one not particularly innocent dwarf, seems like a fair trade, right? I, Tyrion, am trading my own life. I'm sacrificing myself to try to save tens of thousands of innocents. So that's self-sacrifice. So you've got advisor Varys self-sacrificing, advisor Tyrion self-sacrificing. Will advisor Davos engage in some sort of self-sacrifice? He arguably already does, right? He takes part in Tyrion's plan with Jaime, and he may die for it. Who knows? So I wonder whether self-sacrifice will become a theme again in this episode. That and forgiveness, I think, are the two main ideas that are supposed to lead to a better world. And we've seen forgiveness talked about. We've seen self-sacrifice talked about. I wonder if it'll be part of the very end tonight. What do you think, Emma?
I hope it is. I think we've discussed before how I think that forgiveness and mercy are both things that are integral, really, to the message that I think George is trying to portray. I don't know how much time they have to get into it or what circumstances that choice of self-sacrifice would come up in. If it does, I imagine it's probably Jon deciding he's going to go all cold hands and, disappear up north as penance for doing some crime, presumably, or, bad thing that he's morally unhappy with himself for, which presumably would be killing Dany.
Can I break in here for a second to say that
yeah.
That's a really great point. And arguably, they've muddied the waters on that point, because I, too, thought that, all along, I've said, and I'm sure plenty of other people have said, that I thought Jon would end up wandering north of the Wall. I thought he would be a cold hands figure, just like you said. And I thought that would be the ultimate sacrifice for Jon, because unlike everyone else who desperately wants to live, Jon kind of wants to die, or at the very least doesn't want to live an unnaturally long, extended life. And if he did that, that would be the ultimate sacrifice for him, ironically, living forever or living. Now, I don't think they're going to do some magical thing in the show after all with him, because they seem not be too interested in magic. But wandering north of the Wall as a sacrifice for Jon makes sense. But they sort of changed that by saying he'd be happiest there, right? When he departs with Tormund, Tormund's like, you'd be happier north of the Wall. You should come here. And Jon says, I wish I could, but I won't. So that sort of messes up this idea of it being a sacrifice.
Yeah. I imagine it will be quite different in the books, in that Jon will presumably be functionally immortal at this point, and so he will end up, living this, interminable life where, maybe he enjoys like 50 years of it because he's just chilling with Tormund and Tormund's kids, but then he just doesn't age, and everyone around him just ages and dies, and everyone he knows and loved just ages and dies, and then he just can't be in public anymore because he's like obviously undead. and like all of his animals, like it would be like quite a sad existence to have, just sort of wandering this hinterland with nothing but your elk and wolf, like.
Yeah, right. Or maybe in the show it'll be positive. He'll be palling around with Tormund, and it'll be great. Who knows? We'll
Yeah.
get to see one or the other tonight. Okay, we have about, I don't know, a little over 15 minutes left, 15, 20 minutes left. And I'm going to take us to a place where NOWIE usually doesn't go, which is saying some things that are potentially critical of the show. Let me explain the reason that we usually don't do a lot of that. First of all, I have been an eternal optimist throughout, and also I like the model Robert, who came on earlier today, has set of analyzing without evaluating, really. I mean, one thing you could see yourself as someone who talks about this stuff is an evaluator, but another thing is just an analyzer. People can like it, they can not like it, but we're going to try to understand it. And that's how I see us. And look, a lot of people love the show. I have loved the show for years of my life, and I don't want to make that experience worse for anyone. But we're at the very end of the pregame, saved it for the end, and I do think that what Dany did, what happened in the last episode, is controversial for a reason. So I'm going to give some thoughts about this. Let me start by saying that I think that how much, for me anyway, how much deference to give the showrunners has a lot to do with the whole of what they do. So if they do a lot of things that I think are really great, then I'm willing to say when something doesn't make perfect sense to me, okay, look, this is hard to do and you've got to take some liberties, and I get that. But at some point when there are a lot of things that seem confusing, then it's harder to do that. And I have felt that certainly in season 7, it's very well chronicled, the White Hunt, Tyrion's idea, hey, let's send a party north of the wall to get one white and bring it back, because that'll convince Cersei to be on our side. Didn't seem ideal to me. I think it's exceedingly unlikely that that's going to be in the books. It just seemed like, didn't make a lot of sense. And then this season, one of the hallmarks of stories that work really well, I think, is when things have been set up from the beginning. And this is consistent with George R.R. Martin being a gardener, not an architect. You don't have to know everything exactly the way it's going to happen, but you have to understand where you're going with things so that when you lay the groundwork, when you put in clues, they're clues to somewhere rather than clues to nowhere. And George has said this. He said if you write a series of books where you've decided that the butler did it, and so someone on the internet guesses during the series of books that the butler did it, and you decide, oh, I'm going to change it to make it a surprise, and now the maid did it, now you've messed up the story. And so here you've got in the show talk in the last season, this is recently, talk about a possible Dany pregnancy at the end of season 7. They don't have to bring that up. They do bring it up. So far it has gone nowhere. No Dany pregnancy. Maybe it'll happen this episode, maybe it won't, but if it doesn't, it went nowhere. The Cersei pregnancy, which they really emphasized in the last season, basically went nowhere. Yes, they talked about it, but she didn't have to be pregnant for anything that happened, I thought, in season 8, really. I mean, they brought it up, but I thought it pretty much went nowhere. The idea of democracy was brought up in season 7. Tyrion says to Dany, let's talk about the succession. The Ironborn have a way of doing this. The Night's Watch have a way of doing this. Those are references to democracy or some sort of voting. Has not been brought up once in season 8. Maybe it'll be brought up tonight. Maybe it won't. The Golden Company, talked about in season 7. Yes, they came, but nothing really happened with them. You could have had the Lannister army outside the gates if you wanted to. It didn't have to be the Golden Company. So it feels to me like when they wrote season 7, they didn't know what they were going to do in season 8. And as a result, they emphasized a lot of things, or they dropped a lot of ideas that were profoundly important, really big things that ended up not going anywhere. And that made me worry. And then when something happens like what Dany does, I'm not saying that something like that won't happen in the books, but I'm saying that if it does happen in the books, what Dany does, I don't think anyone's going to be asking, why did she do it? Whereas everyone is asking why she did it. The reason Robert needed to make that video, which is called something like Why Did Daenerys Burn King's Landing, is we saw it and we're like, I don't get it. Why did she have to kill the people? The people weren't harming her. They weren't fighting against her. They had already surrendered. The people weren't even fighting in the first place. The troops had surrendered and thrown down their swords. So everyone's wondering why she did it. And there are explanations, but the explanations do not emerge that clearly from the fact of her doing it. Even all the things Robert says in his video, she had lost her advisors, she was angry, on and on and on and on and on. There was foreshadowing of her burning cities. Of course, all of that is understood, but none of it is specific to killing random civilians. None of that is a specific reason to kill the random civilians. And if it were just supposed to throw up our hands and say, well, sometimes people do that, historically, sometimes people have done it, which is true in universe and out, it happens. Still, I don't know. I don't think that wasn't a good enough explanation for me. But I leave it to all of you to decide what you think, and to Emma to tell us what she thinks.
Yeah, I think as I mentioned on the post game, it wasn't a turn that I was particularly happy with. However, like, and my issue with it is not that it is not set up, or I don't think it's going to happen in the books, or I was upset that Dany did that. I do definitely think it is going to happen in the books, and I definitely think that the show needed to include it. I think the issues stem quite a lot in sort of getting rid of the Aegon Targaryen plotline and getting rid of Dany's adventures through Essos, which will primarily be her just burning everything and winning when she does that. So I think it will be entirely understandable in the books. Like, what we will see is her burning the Dothraki Carls and taking over as the stallion who mounts the world, with the Dosh Carleen kneeling in front of her, and that fire won. And then she will go to the Slavers Bay to pick up the Unsullied, and she will just burn her way through the Slavers, and she will win. And we will cheer because it's slavery. Like, she's liberating Slavers Bay. Even though we've seen the terrible, terrible price of what that liberation is during her trying to rule Meereen, she's embraced this sort of fire and blood heritage, and she'll burn her way through Essos, and she will be egged on in large part by this really nihilistic, really broken Tyrion, who is vengeful and has this personal vendetta against the people of King's Landing. And then she'll burn Volantis, and we'll care a bit more because she's getting a bit burny now, but it's still slavery. We still, in general, feel positive for her. She's the saviour, and then she'll go to Pentos and confront Illyrio, and then it'll get personal, and she will burn Pentos, and we're like, I'm a bit less okay with this, because this isn't a liberation arc anymore. This is just personal vengeance. And then she will get to King's Landing, and she will see the people of King's Landing cheering this pretender, who she knows is a pretender because Tyrion will have told her gleefully about this, pretend boy who's really a Blackfire, but he's saying he's a Targaryen so he can steal your throne. And she will see all the innocents of King's Landing cheering him, and then she will lose her temper, and Tyrion will exact his vengeance via Daenerys on the population of King's Landing, and it will be horrifying. And then we have to examine ourselves, like, why did we care less about the population of Slavers Bay than we do about the population of King's Landing, when the end result is exactly the same, which is death and devastation on a scale unimaginable?
Oh, fantastic. Really glad you mentioned that, all of it. And in particular, I definitely see it the same way, in that George wants to use this tactic, which is an awesome tactic, which is to tell these stories where we root for someone to be violent to someone else. We root for vengeance, let's say, or justice. And we're cheering when this violence happens, just like you said. And the point ultimately is we need to identify in ourselves a moral failing. We need to realize, wait a minute, I was cheering when she's killing these people in Essos who seem different. And then suddenly I'm aghast when she's killing people in Westeros who don't seem different. Or I've been cheering violence all along, and suddenly I realize, oh, wait a minute, look where that led.
And I mean, Theon's that in miniature, right? And like after a Clash of Kings, we're like, yeah, you get yours. And then we see him in a Dance of Dragons, and you're like, holy crikey, oh my God, no, nothing like that. And I think it is there to, obviously, like, Arya's storyline is presumably this, and it got touched on in the last episode about how vengeance ultimately is a destructive force. Like, no matter what you do, vengeance is this whirlpool of devastation and destruction, and it's horrifying, and you probably shouldn't do that because it will make you bitter and sad. And
oh yes, and it'll just result in more violence and doesn't usually lead where you want it to lead, even in the situations where it seems most justified. I think that oh, and by the way, holy crikey, I want to incorporate into my vocabulary.
I was going to swear, and then I was like, hang on, like, no, this is pre-watershed in the US.
No, I know you were going to, and you caught yourself. It's fantastic. Had you sworn, it would have been okay too, but even better, you never know who doesn't want to hear it. And just the Britishness of crikey is a gift to all of us in the Western Hemisphere.
You are very welcome.
But on the theme of violence, making us root for the wrong thing, when Arya murdered, so even going back, Sansa turns Ramsay's hounds on him and kills Ramsay in a particularly horrifying way. Now, this is Ramsay we're talking about, the absolute worst person ever. And she kills him in this horrifying way, and then she walks away smiling. And surely the overwhelming response among viewers was, yay. And I think that, and then Arya kills House Frey, kills the men in House Frey. And I can tell you, I was super happy and excited about this. I felt this visceral surge of righteous anger being channeled against the Freys and thinking, yes, these people did the Red Wedding, and we were told these are the specific people who did the Red Wedding, and I was happy. And I think that the point is that part of me that was happy when that happened, the part of all of us who were happy about what Sansa did and then smiled about it, and Arya, by the way, also smiles when she walks out of the room after killing House Frey, is a part of us that we should be afraid of, a part of us that we should really examine and potentially reject. Now, whatever we all think and decide individually is our moral code and what we think about what Sansa did and what Arya did, I think it's very likely, I would bet that George R.R. Martin's moral code that he's trying to show in the story is we cheer for these things and we shouldn't be cheering for these things. Violence is a dead end. It's very, very dangerous, even when it seems justified, even when the victim is the worst person in the world. Beware of violence because it leads to places you don't want to go.
Yeah, definitely. I can't really put it any better than that.
That's saying a lot. I don't know if I agree, but thank you. All right, a couple minutes left. Emma, any thoughts about a last topic?
So there are a couple of questions that we could probably get to that I pulled from the chat. So Bronn, we haven't talked about Bronn at all. So someone raised the possibility that whether he's likely to take out Drogon or not. I think you and I have discussed that we tend to think it's more likely to be Arya than Bronn. But do you see Bronn's storyline going anywhere? I quite enjoy the irony of he's relied on the two Lannister brothers, and both of them are now going to die this episode, so he's still not got his castles.
Interesting, because I think that Bronn plays into this violence arc we're talking about. Right? Bronn certainly could kill Drogon, since Bronn nearly killed Drogon once already. Bronn, as the guy who fights dragons, is a thing. And if they wanted to keep Arya pure, right, if they wanted to preserve this new Arya arc of no violence, one way to do it would be to have somebody else kill Drogon, and it could be Bronn. So that's a possibility. If that happens, though, if that's the point, if the point is violence is bad, we're going to not have Arya go back to violence, we're going to have Bronn do it, then hard to see how that would square with Bronn getting Highgarden, let's say, or a castle, being rewarded for a life of violence. And Bronn doesn't really turn away from it at all. When we see him in season 8, he's still talking about the same kind of thing. He says, you know, my days of fighting are over, meaning in wars, but my days of killing aren't. So that maybe they don't want to. Maybe the message is not to reward Bronn for that. On the other hand, I've thought in the past, I thought going into this season that Bronn would get Casterly Rock. I think it would be very interesting for him to get Casterly Rock. Maybe he'll get Highgarden. Who knows? I certainly, they're not going to forget about Bronn. That would be pretty terrible if they did. If they just didn't mention him at all, something's going to happen with him. Could be killing the dragon, could be not. I could also see him dying. That's very possible. If Bronn is about violence, and violence leads to death for you and everyone else, then maybe Bronn gets killed. Maybe Bronn gets killed trying to kill the dragon or something.
Yeah, I definitely don't think that Bronn's like pro-violence rhetoric. You know, assuming that the overarching theme is a rejection of violence. I don't think that Bronn, who is, like he says in his, you know, basic thesis, you know, a couple of episodes ago, is I'm a violent bastard and that's what we all do and your ancestors were, and that's where all the houses came from, so I'm going to be that so that I can set up my own house. So I don't think that rhetoric should be rewarded with one of the most lucrative kingdoms in the Seven Kingdoms. So yeah, he definitely needs to be out of the picture somehow. Don't Again, like, I'm not a huge fan of them just killing people willy-nilly in service of sort of political aims. Like, I don't mind everyone being massacred for the long night because that's self-sacrifice, so it comes across as heroic and more epic than wars over petty kingdoms. But again, that is probably part of the critique that I should analyse in and of myself. But yeah, don't know.
If Bronn does get rewarded with a castle, I think that the message could be, look, this is not entirely a happy story. Obviously, it's bittersweet, and sometimes violent people get rewarded. Sometimes things that aren't the moral of the story of what should happen end up being what happens. So if that happens, I think that's probably the way for us to understand it. And speaking of us deciding how to understand it after we've seen it, we're going to go now. People can watch Robert's live stream in Deep Geek, which is about to begin. And we will be back for the NOWIE post-game. Emma Smith, in the middle of the night in England, will be there for as long as she can stay awake. I will be there. And others, Painkiller Jane and Sarah O'Connor, who are fantastic, are coming too. So tune into the NOWIE post-game right after the show ends tonight, and we will see you there. Emma, I can never thank you enough.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on, and thank you to Robert as well for coming on earlier. His insights were amazing as always, and yeah, he's got a stream starting right now, so you can just hop straight over there. Jojo Lady Jane's helpfully dropped the link, so yeah.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone. We'll see you right after the episode ends.
Ciao.